everyone, and welcome to the Good Arguments podcast. I'm your host, David Dispute, and man, do we have a wild topic for you today. We are talking about the sons of God, the Nephilim, and the mighty heroes of old from Genesis 6, 1-4. So if you love legends, mythology, superhero movies, anything like that, and you've ever wondered, where did we come up with that stuff? Well, it all seems to trace back to whatever's being reported on in Genesis 6, 1-4. And if you've ever set out to read and study Genesis, you know that these 4 verses just scream out for explanation, especially if you're a believer, right? It's like, okay, Genesis 1, we have the creation story, which serves as the foundation for work and rest. Gen 2, we have the foundation for marriage. Gen 3, we have the foundation story of sin. Gen 4 and 5, Cain murders his brother Abel, and we see the increase of sin and the origin of Cain descendants and Seth descendants. And so all that tracks and it flows. And if we didn't know the rest of the story, we might predict that, Cain's descendants would always be fighting with Seth's descendants, which of course does happen. But for these 4 verses at the beginning of chapter 6, it feels like we're reading a fantasy comic book more than the Bible. And look, I know that the Bible has a talking snake and Moses parting the Red Sea and Elijah calling fire from heaven. But seriously, these 4 verses have to win the contest for the most extraordinary in all of Scripture when you think about it. And we will, obviously, we'll dig into this. So I should probably mention that I don't have a guest today, and I'll tell you why. Pretty much everyone who tries to explain this passage does a few things. Many people spend lots of time explaining the various ways this passage has been interpreted, only to make their humble, open-handed pitch at the very end. And they usually fill their talk with disclaimers, that it could be this or it could be that, and there's smart people on all sides, yada, yada, yada. Okay, cool. That's pretty much the case with everything in the Bible, so I will not be doing that today. Another thing some people do is to take forever, like multiple hours, combing through these 4 verses. And again, I get it, there's tons to discuss. But I really respect your time, so I will not be doing that. So I'm going to read the passage, first in the ESV, then in the KJV, and then again in the NET, which is the New English Translation. And I'll explain why after. So here we go with the ESV. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now let's read the KJV. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And now finally the NET. When humankind began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful. Thus they took wives for themselves from any they chose. So the Lord said, My spirit will not remain in humankind indefinitely, since they are mortal. They will remain for 120 more years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after this, when the sons of God would sleep with the daughters of humankind, who gave birth to their children. They were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. Okay, so I hope you can see why I read these 3 translations. Obviously, there were several important differences in how these verses have been translated. And you probably noticed how each one attempts to interpret the meaning of the text. And look, unless you've studied biblical Hebrew, you won't understand why it's so challenging to translate the text into English. So please, before you start accusing certain translations of mistranslating or misinterpreting the text, just be aware that every translation is an interpretation on some level. If you don't believe me, take 2 years of biblical Hebrew at seminary and find out, okay? So like I said, I'm not going to go into every opposing view. If you want to hear about the different views, check out Peter Gentry's video, and also check out Allison Park's church podcast where they discuss the 4 views. So right now, I'm going to walk us through what I think is the correct interpretation and why. And I'm going to use the ESV as my base translation because I think it has the least amount of interpretive word choices. It's more of a straight word-for-word translation. Okay, so here we go. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. Okay, we have to stop right there. This is the least controversial and least interesting phrase in the entire section. In fact, there's nothing really controversial about it. Humans were told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and that's exactly what they seem to be doing, right? In Genesis 4, we get a genealogy of Cain's descendants, and in Genesis 5, we get to learn about Seth's descendants. So other than Lamech bragging about being a brutal murderer, things appear to be ticking along just as one would expect. Cain builds a city, his descendants were inventing things like tents and farming and musical instruments and metal tools. But actually, I take that back. There are 2 peculiar aspects about the ancient people on Seth's side, which are worth noting. They aren't mentioned as inventing anything. Cain's line gets all the credit for innovations, right? That should stand out to us. And 2, Seth's line has extremely long lifespans listed, whereas Cain's line doesn't list them at all. But for Seth's line, we're talking about 912 years for Seth, 962 for Jared, and 969 for Methuselah. But if you thought that was crazy, listen to when some of these people had their kids. Jared had Enoch when he was 162. Methuselah had Lamech, and that's a different Lamech than the murdering one. Methuselah supposedly became a father at 187. And taking the cake for the oldest apparent first-time father was Noah when he was 500 when he fathered his 3 sons. So obviously something's going on here. We're probably not supposed to read these lifespans and first-time father ages literally, just like the Sumerian king lists were not to be understood literally. Although in their case, some of their kings lived for over 20,000 years, which is mind-boggling. Imagine just trying to stay alive that long. Anyway, what I think is going on is that before the flood, people lived a lot longer, for sure, maybe because of cleaner genetics, better diet, less disease, a more oxygen-rich environment maybe. Wherever the case may be, they're probably not all the generations that are listed, and the children that are mentioned are probably not the first ones they fathered or grandfathered. So anyway, we could do a whole other podcast on various theories of the long ages, so we'll just set that aside for now. All right, so people are spreading across the earth. There could be easily millions of people by then. All right, so now let's read the rest of verse 1 and the first part of verse 2. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. Okay, so the first big question is, who are the sons of God? And I think the clear answer is they are angels. In other words, powerful beings that were created by the one true God, whose primary domain is in a higher dimension than ours, some kind of heavenly realm. So why is this the best explanation? Well, whenever we're trying to interpret a biblical text, the first question we have to ask is, what genre is it? What kind of text are we dealing with? And I tend to agree with scholars like John Walton and Gordon Wenham that Genesis 1-11 should be classified as ancient Near Eastern theological narrative that is interacting in a polemical way with the mythologies of Israel's neighbors. In other words, the author of Genesis 1-11 is using the language of myth to demythologize and correct the theology of the other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. So, if that's true, the author knows all of the legends of old that involved gods, lower G, and his audience knew about this idea of gods who mingled with humans. The next question we have to ask is, what does the word or phrase mean in the immediate context? And the immediate context here is describing a contrast between the sons of God and the daughters of man. And man in the Hebrew is ha-adam, which literally means the man or mankind. So the ESV and NET get it right here. The KJV says daughters of men, which is both incorrect and a bit misleading. If the writer wanted to say daughters of men, he would have written benot anashim, but he didn't. So the contrast is between some kind of men and human women. So it's more likely that the contrast is between angels who took male form and humans, rather than one type of human with another type of human. Next, we have the wider context, which we'll get into more detail, obviously. But it's that the sons of God and the daughters of man had children, which were no ordinary children. This, again, would support the idea that the sons of God are angels, or at least not just humans. And then there's the canonical context, which is how the same phrase is used in other parts of the Bible and other references to this story in the Bible. Because one of the most important interpretive principles is that we let Scripture interpret Scripture. So we find the exact phrase sons of God in Job 1:6 and 2:1, and in those passages they clearly refer to angelic beings, including the Satan. Also in the Psalms, Psalm 89:6-7, the phrase B'nai Elim, which is practically the same phrase, there it refers to God's heavenly council of angels. And Psalm 29:1, it's a little bit more ambiguous, but even there the KJV translates it mighty, which supports the angel view. So any honest word study will lead to the angel view. And then we have the New Testament references of 2 Peter and Jude 6. Both these guys mention this ancient story, and they describe creatures who sinned as straight up angels, angelus. So it's almost beyond a shadow of a doubt that the sons of God were heavenly beings who took human form as men and were attracted to human women. So let's keep going. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. All right. So they got married. Now, the reason this sentence is controversial is because to modern readers, this sounds like the sons of God did something coercive or oppressive. We see the took, and we don't talk like that today, right? We say he found the love of his life and they tied the knot and things like that. But in that Hebrew culture, the phrase to take a wife just meant to get married. Now, but then you might say, yeah, but they took wives from any they chose. That sounds like the women had no choice, right? But again, you'd be reading this through modern eyes. So yeah, the women may not have had much choice, just like Mary, the mother of Jesus, probably didn't have much choice in marrying Joseph. Arranged marriage was common in most ancient cultures, but the point is, the fathers would have had to give permission to marry their daughters. So what this seems to be saying is that the sons of God were so impressive that any woman they wanted to marry, the fathers would allow it. Who knows, maybe they were even hoping for one of these sons of God to come knocking on their door. And I think there's something else going on here that we need to see, this literary connection. Remember Eve in the Garden of Eden when she was considering the fruit? She saw that it was a delight to the eyes, and then she took some and gave to her husband, who was complicit in that act. And here with the sons of God, we see that they're seeing the daughters of men that are attractive, and then they're taking them as wives, and then the fathers were complicit in this action. So let's continue with verse 3. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. So, believe it or not, there are 4 debated aspects to this verse alone. First, what does it mean that God's spirit will not abide or strive or remain in or with man forever or indefinitely? So if you've read Genesis from the beginning, you know that before God formed the earth, his spirit, or ruach in the Hebrew, was hovering over the waters, meaning he was not going to emerge from the watery chaos like in the other creation stories, but that he was transcendent or above or had authority over the waters, perhaps even calming them with his spirit. And so this is the second time in Genesis we see the word ruach when it refers to God's spirit. And now we get to the word translated abide in or strive with and remain in. And actually, if we turn to even more translations, we also get contend with from the NIV. And the NLT says put up with. And others couldn't decide, so they just put multiple words in just to cover their bases. So which translation gets it right? Well, I actually think the KJV, NIV, and NLT give the better renderings with strive with and contend with and put up with. And here's the thing. The word in the Hebrew is yadon, and it's a hapax legomenon, which means it only appears once within a text. In this case, it's only here in the whole Old Testament, which is why it's so hard to translate. And then the preposition that's added to it is ba, which actually means in or at, normally, but can also mean with. The usual preposition for with is la, but in this case, I think it's with, because think about it. Adam and Eve have already been kicked out of the garden because of their sin. They were already denied access to the tree of life, which meant they no longer enjoyed close fellowship with God's presence. So it would seem impossible for God's Spirit to be dwelling in mankind at this point. It makes much better sense to say that God's Spirit was always striving with or contending with humans, trying to convict their hearts. But apparently they would resist him for literally centuries per person. You know, remember what Stephen said to the Jewish council who were questioning him right before he was martyred? He said, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you." So it seemed mankind was always fighting back against the conviction of the Holy Spirit for hundreds of years per person. And so God said, enough is enough. The second interpretive issue is the word olam here in the Hebrew, meaning forever. Now, for some odd reason, the KJV just leaves out the word altogether. The ESV has forever, and the NET has indefinitely. And I think the NET actually gets it right. God's essentially saying, I'm not going to allow you to defy me indefinitely for hundreds and hundreds of years. The third problem word is the word bashar. The ESV says, for he is flesh, as does the KJV. But the NET says, since they are mortal. Now, bashar literally means flesh. And so normally you'd say that's the best translation. But flesh can mean all kinds of things in Hebrew. And mortal is one of them. But here's where it gets tricky. If God were talking about both the angels and the humans, flesh would be the better translation because humans obviously have flesh and angels took on flesh to get married to the women. But you see, God's not talking about both angels and humans because he says his spirit will not always strive with man, that is mankind. So again, I think the NET gets it right here. God's essentially saying, I don't need to let you humans live so long. After all, you're only mortal, unlike the angels. You see that? And this leads us into our fourth challenge in the verse, and that's the 120 years reference. Now, it can either mean I'm going to cut people's lifespans so that they'll only live up to 120 years old, or I'm going to wipe out all these people in 120 years' time. In the Hebrew, it's completely ambiguous. The ESV and KJV preserve the ambiguity, but the NET interprets the phrase and renders it, they will remain for 120 more years. So which one is it? Well, I actually lean towards the lifespan interpretation because after the flood, the lifespans decline significantly, and eventually people only live until 120. So just like in the Garden of Eden, when God said to Adam, in the day you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. When Adam ate the fruit, he didn't die that very day. It just meant he was now on the road to physical death. Likewise, that's probably what's going on here with the lifespans. God was saying, I'm going to decrease your lifespans eventually so that it caps out at 120. And that's what we've seen these past millennia. Okay, so we've finally come to the best and most controversial verse of them all. Are you ready? Let's read it, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. All right, so the first question is, who are the Nephilim? Well, if you remember, the KJV translated this word giants. Now, why did they do that? Well, it's for several reasons. First of all, I need to say the word Nephilim isn't actually a translation at all. It's a transliteration, meaning we're just saying the Hebrew word and adopting it into our language, just like we do with the word baguette from France and tsunami from Japan. The Hebrew word is just Nephilim. So the KJV translates it giants because that's what the word apparently means from the context of Numbers 13, 32 to 33. In that passage, and it's the only other passage in the Old Testament where the word is used, Moses sends spies to spy out the land of Canaan, and when they come back, this is what it says. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Okay, so clearly in this passage, the Nephilim are described as being really tall and vicious. In addition to this, the LXX, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, translates Nephilim as gigantes, giants, obviously. So it's a great translation by the KJV. However, that's not the end of the story. You see, the three root consonants in the word Nephilim are nun, pe, and lamed, which form the word nafal, which is the verb to fall, and the im at the end just pluralizes it. So the actual word likely means the fallen ones. Now that is significant. So far the Nephilim are giants and possibly the fallen ones. But the million-dollar question is, are they the offspring of these sexual unions between angels and humans? And my answer is no, I don't think so. And let's discuss why. First, we have to note something interesting in the Hebrew. This verse doesn't begin with the word "and." You see, in Hebrew narrative, almost every sentence will begin with a vayiktol, which is the letter vav, which means "and," plus an imperfect verb. It's a verb form that drives the narrative forward with a chronological sequence. But here, we don't get that vayiktol, meaning there's a little bit of a break here. The author seems to be saying to the reader, hold on, let's just take a quick time out from the action. I need to say something important to clear up some confusion. So he says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. Do you see why I highlighted those phrases? The author seems to be saying, in case you think the Nephilim are the offspring of the unholy sexual unions between godlike beings and humans, they were there already when this started happening, and they were around after the flood. And that's exactly what we read about in Numbers 13. He seems to be saying, sure, the Nephilim are tall and brutal and vicious, but they're just people. Remember Goliath? He was one of them. He was from Gath. Joshua was supposed to destroy all the Anakim, but some from Gath survived. And in Numbers 13, the Anakim are said to be descendants of the Nephilim. All this means that Goliath was essentially a type of Nephilim. He was really tall, really vicious, but he was human, and a shepherd boy named David killed him with a slingshot. So commentators have tried very hard to explain how Nephilim made it through the flood, which was supposed to have killed all flesh, except for the people on the ark, the 8 people. So some say it wasn't a global flood, so they survived somewhere else. And others say the angel-human unions were the source of the Nephilim, so they must have done it again after the flood. Well, neither of these views have any evidence whatsoever. So I think the best explanation is that the giant genes, so to speak, made its way onto the ark via one of the wives, probably Ham's wife. Ham is, of course, the one whose line produces the Egyptians and the Canaanites, so this wife is the best candidate for smuggling in the giant genes. So then, if the violent Nephilim aren't the progeny of the angel-human marriages, who were? Well, this is the part that's most difficult, and I must confess, I feel the least confident with this question. But let's read the last line of our passage in those three translations we read at the beginning, starting with the ESV. It reads, "These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." The KJV says, "The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." And the NET says, "They were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men." So the question is, that first word in the phrase that's translated these or the same and they, whom did they refer to? The Nephilim or the offspring of the unholy unions? Grammatically, it's impossible to tell. So we turn to the context. And to get this right, we have to have done proper exegesis of the text so far, right? Otherwise, we'll just choose whatever fits our preference better. So if it's true that the Nephilim are just tall, violent humans who show up before and after the flood, it seems we have two legitimate options. Option one, the Nephilim were the mighty men of old, the legendary men like Gilgamesh, but that these were just humans, so don't worry about them. Don't think they're demigods, even though that's what your neighbors believe, and they've written countless stories about them. Even though angels did indeed have intercourse with humans, the Nephilim weren't actually demigods, they're just humans. So don't worry. And these demigods, they're just a bunch of subhuman creatures who are not created in my image and my likeness, so I'll feel no remorse in wiping them off the face of the earth. That's option one, and perfectly plausible in my mind. Option two is this. The Nephilim were tall and brutal, but they weren't anything special. It was really the children born to angels and humans who were the mighty men of old, men of renown like Gilgamesh. These unholy unions produced demigods who were not only tall, but extremely powerful and violent and filled the earth with violence. And I need to rid the earth of these beasts before they destroy everything and everyone. That's option two. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure which one is more likely. Both seem relatively plausible if we just look within this text itself. But are there clues elsewhere in the Bible we can draw from? And can we consult the rabbinic literature to see if they can help? Well, let's see. Let's start with this question. Where do demons come from? Have you ever asked yourself this question? If you're like me, you probably grew up thinking they were just fallen angels. But that's not what Second Temple Judaism and early Christians believed. The book of 1st Enoch was a highly influential book during the time of Christ. But even though it's not considered inspired by Protestant Christians, the Bible does refer to its contents in various ways, and it just reflects many of the beliefs that Jews had at the time. So 1st Enoch basically retells Genesis 6, 1-4, but fills in all of the details like who were these angels, their names, and how they produced giants, etc. But in chapter 15 of 1st Enoch, it explains where demons come from, starting at verse 8. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh, that's the angels and humans, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men and from the holy watchers, which again are the angels, is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling, but as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth, on the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. Did you get that? 1st Enoch teaches that evil spirits, or what we now call demons, are the dead offspring of the unholy unions. In other words, When the angel-human hybrid children died, they kept on living, but as evil spirits on the earth. That's the clearest origin story for demons in any Jewish literature. And you might be surprised to learn that the Old Testament only mentions evil spirits or demons twice with the word shedim. We have Deuteronomy 32:17, which says Israel has made a habit of turning to false gods, which were essentially demons. And Psalm 106:37, which says the same thing. So if the origin of demons is true, does it help us understand who the Nephilim were? Well, sort of. You see, the writers of 1st Enoch likely wrote originally in Aramaic, and then it was translated into Greek and other languages, and we don't have any copies whatsoever where the word Nephilim is used for the offspring. All the translations we have are equivalents to the word giants and not Nephilim. This is important. So if the Enochian writers were trying to fill in all the details to this story and thought the Nephilim were the offspring of the unholy unions, then they would have explained how they made it through the flood. But they don't. Do you see? The Midrash and other apocryphal works try to explain how the Nephilim made it through the flood, but 1st Enoch only explains how the evil spirits of the dead offspring of the angel-human unions roamed the earth, even to the present day. So if Goliath, being a Nephilim, became a demon after his death, I think we would have read about that somewhere. So I don't hold this tightly, but here's my tentative conclusion. The Nephilim were tall, brutal people who existed before the angel-human marriages, and they existed after the flood, probably because the giant genes were passed on through Ham's wife. But the offspring of the angel-human marriages were the real problem. They were giants as well, and maybe even taller and more brutal, and these demigods were the heroes of old that ancient people wrote about. And they're the real reason why the flood was necessary. Mankind was complicit in joining with the angels, and this hybrid race had become a disease on the earth. They were mortal in the physical sense, but immortal in the spiritual sense. So when they died, they became evil spirits who roamed the earth. All right. So that was pretty intense. This is absolutely one of the craziest stories in the Bible. It would seem that all ancient stories of demigods probably have their origin in some real historical event. But what do you think? I'd love it if you'd leave a comment, follow, subscribe, share this with a friend. I'd really appreciate it. So thanks for listening to the Good Arguments podcast, and we'll see you next time.